Thank you, Don, or Mike. We're getting all sorts of fun things going on today. Good morning, church. If you've ever talked with me about my passions, what I enjoy, especially if we're talking about books or movies, you will know fantasy is one of my preferred genres. There's just something for me, especially in classic fantasies and high fantasies, that I enjoy. They've got dragons and castles and armies. I grant you that dragons may be mythical, maybe. But fortresses, which are a pretty common theme in most fantasy books, fortresses are very much real. We have fortresses that we see all across the world. There is one fortress in particular that is 5,000 years old. Did I put a picture? I don't think I put a picture, did I? Aside from just what I have here. Next slide's Bible verses. Okay. I thought about it and then obviously forgot to do it. But if you want to look it up, it's the Citadel of Aleppo. It's in Syria. The Citadel of Aleppo, it is considered to be about 5,000 years old. It would be the oldest fortress that we, at least as far as trying to date things is concerned, would be the oldest, longest standing fortress. That it is like still there, and it's got the pieces on the top where archers can hide and they could shoot down. It's got a moat surrounding it, so as armies try to cross, they might fall down, and it's a really impressive structure, 5,000 years. But what's interesting about the Citadel of Aleppo is it's not just a place where you can defend. Inside the Citadel, there's an amphitheater, there's places to stay and to sleep. It's not just a place where you can survive. You could actually thrive in this fortress. And it has stood the test of time. Like I said, 5,000 years. Weather has not beaten it. No assaults were ever done against it that succeeded. 5,000 years. But you know, if someone wanted to attack the Citadel of Aleppo today, it is a stone fortress. And in the last 5,000 years, science and technology have found ways that can defeat stone fortresses. I'm pretty certain if bombs and tanks were used against the Citadel of Aleppo, it would not remain standing. Many fortresses, and we see this all throughout history, many fortresses, once they are built, they just kind of remain. They don't get that many improvements. Once that last stone is put, once that last wall is secured, that fortress is as good about as it's gonna get. But what if you knew there was a fortress that constantly changed and evolved to always provide security? A fortress that nothing could ever defeat. That's the kind of fortress that the Psalms talk about when they say God is our fortress. If you want to follow along your Bibles this morning, we're going to be in Psalm 62. Psalm 62 is going to talk to us about this fortress God and what that looks like. Psalm 62, I'm going to start reading here in verse 1. For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. How long will all of you attack a man to batter him, like a leaning wall, a tottering fence? They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. They take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rests my salvation and my glory, my mighty rock. My refuge is God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your hearts before him. God is a refuge for us. Those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are a delusion. In the balances they go up. They are together lighter than a breath. Put no trust in extortion. Set no vain hopes on robbery. If riches increase, set not your hearts on them. Once God has spoken, twice I have heard this, that power belongs to God, and that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love. For you will render to a man according to his work. Okay, you might be noticing how poetic this psalm is in particular. Psalms can use all sorts of poetry. Sometimes it's really colorful vocabulary. Sometimes it's poetic devices. In some psalms, like this psalm in particular, it uses poetic structure. Singing is a way in which we learn to remember things. And psalms, all 150 of them, are designed to be sung. Now, because they are Hebrew words that have then been translated into English, they don't tend to have that many rhyming structures for us in the way that the English mindset, our language, the way we tend to write songs. But there's some interesting ways that you can put psalms together. And so we will sing certain songs that are actually 100% word for word the psalms of the Bible. And again, we're blessed with creative minds. There's a Christian rapper named Lecrae, who actually took about half of this psalm and sung it kind of all together in a much more lyrical rhythm. And I would reproduce it if I could, but you guys should know I'm not that good at that. But there's something about the psalms that works for remembrance. And so this psalm is structured as you sing it or as we read it. It's designed to help you remember. And so there are pairs in this psalm. What's at the beginning can be found again in the middle, or it can be found again in the end, but they're paired verses. So this morning, what I want to do for you is break down 3 different pairs throughout these psalms and some takeaways throughout this psalm, some takeaways that I find as we look at this poetic structure. The first point that I think the psalmist wants to emphasize, so he's going to do it in 2 different places. First point I think he's emphasizing, God is the only source of refuge that you will ever need. Right? God is the only source of refuge that you will ever need. There's a lot of things that you can take refuge in, right? That you would take refuge in safety refuge being safety and comfort, familiarity. In case you don't tend to use refuge in your daily vocabulary, it's what makes you feel at ease, right? You're not wound up, you're not wandering, looking around. Like once you are in a place of refuge, you feel safe. There's a lot of things we take refuge in. You might take refuge in your family, right? You've got loved ones that are very dear to you, and when things are chaotic in the world, you can go back to family, and family becomes your refuge. It might be in your country that you look all around the world, you see lots of bad things, and for you, if you are in your country, that at least gives you a form of refuge, that you're not going to be harmed or touched there. It might be in your finances, that you see all the difficulties and dangers, but hey, for you, you've got the bank account, you've got the things set up in your life, and you take refuge in finances. It might be in careers, where you've built up a career that when everything else is going crazy, you know from this time in the morning to the evening, when you do this set pattern, it's safe, it's familiar, and you can take refuge in that it won't change. In many cases, actually, I think people take refuge in addiction. And they say, you know what, everything else is wild and crazy, but this one bad thing I can always count on. Whether it's a high, whether it's some other emotional response, if I go to this addiction, I will feel better for that amount of time. There's a lot of things people take refuge in. And I think the psalmist says there's actually only one source of refuge you need. Right? You can go to family, but we know relationships, and sometimes families don't treat each other right. And you can go to your career, but if you've watched history unfold, careers can rise and fall. Countries can rise and fall. There's not really a safety net that's really there. And if you want one source of refuge, you go to God. Let's pull up verses 1 and 2 here. He says, "For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock, my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken." It's not just God as being a part of, right? Where I take refuge in my church and I take refuge in my God. Again, I love church. I want church to be good, but let's be honest, church is composed of sinners. We're composed of people. God's not. God's not sinner. God's not going to fall short. In God alone you can take refuge. Why trust in armies? Why trust in weapons? Why trust in strength? Why trust in privilege? Why trust in power? Why trust in prestige? When you can just trust in the one and only source of refuge you'll ever need. Sometimes people don't want to put all their eggs in one basket, and that's the why, right? We don't want to trust only in God. We want to trust partly in God, right? Like, hey, I love God, I worship God, I follow God, but what if I say a prayer and God doesn't answer? So it's really smart for me just to trust in some other things too. That way, just in case God doesn't come through on that one time, I've got my own things secured. Or maybe it's even vice versa. You think, I'm gonna build myself up, and just in case I fail, I also believe in God, and then God can come and cover me. I'm not trying to accuse anyone of anything, but I think there are people who are wary of putting all their eggs in one basket. And so for me to say the only source of refuge you need is God, all those other doubts about how to live life starts going through your head. But the psalmist is not yet done. Let's go ahead and pull up the next slide. So he's going to continue on verse 5. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence. My hope is from him. He alone, he only, is my rock, my salvation, my fortress. See how that pops up 4 times in this psalm? Starts in the beginning, goes again in the middle. He's making sure you catch the drift, right? It's not that God is partly your fortress. God is sometimes your fortress. God is where you go just on the really bad days. It's that God is your refuge. It's like the psalmist, as he's writing, is saying, hey, church, can you hear me? Are you listening? Are you really paying attention? If you're not, I'm just going to say it 4 times so I make sure you understand. God and God alone is your refuge. Now, if you're blessed with a good family, praise God, that's amazing. Right? If you're blessed in the country that you're born in, that you raised in, that you grow up in, that you stay in, that's a great blessing. If you're blessed with the privilege of having finances and those who watched over you, that's great, right? We don't need to disparage the blessings of life, but that's not where we can put our refuge. There's a difference between being thankful for the blessings you have and putting your trust in your blessings. The psalmist says, let's put our refuge in God. Trust in God. And not just God some of the time, not just God part-time, but God only. Why? Like maybe that's a legitimate question to ask, right? Trust in God only. But why God only? It's because God's power exceeds inner and outer evil. So this will be the next case that he makes throughout this psalm. If you want to know why you put your refuge in God and God alone, it's because God has an extreme amount of power. When you read the Bible, like God's power is supreme, right? God's the power that creates the world itself and everything in it, including life itself. That's pretty powerful. But not only did God just make the world, he stayed involved in the world. And so God can interact. And so we see seas splitting. And we see all sorts of miraculous works. Storms coming and storms ending. Plagues descending. Dead people being raised. Like this is a God who interacts with the world. He's got power. And not even just power to do good, but power to fight the forces of darkness, whether those forces of darkness be inside or outside. So he's going to use some verses. We'll go ahead and pull up verses 4 and 5 here, right? Let's talk about inner evil, then we'll talk about outer evil. He talks about people that cause problems, right? Some of those people, they plan, right? You don't necessarily see when people plan, but it's going on, right? These people inside their heads, they're making plans to take people down. They take pleasure in falsehood. You don't even necessarily know if they are lying, but when they lie, there are some people who take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths. Inwardly, they curse. You might think they're a pretty good bloke, but inside, they've got wickedness going on. What is our defense? Sometimes evil is clear. And that's the easiest part for the church to try to work against is clear evil, but sometimes evil is making plans. Sometimes evil is inward, and sometimes evil is, it seems good on the surface, and it's corrupt underneath. Well, how are we supposed to interact with that? Well, actually, I would argue the Christian response is, you're not the one who has to be the judge, are you? Christian response, you're not the one who has to go about fighting every person saying, I know you said a blessing, but I think inwardly you're cursing. That's not on your plate. But we can trust God to handle this one, right? Verse 5 explains that. So he sets up in verse 4 all the bad inner stuff. Verse 5, he says, "For God alone my soul waits in silence. My hope is from him." I don't always like waiting, especially not waiting in silence. Church, you should know by now I like to talk. I get paid to talk. It's a comfort for me. Maybe talking is a refuge for me sometimes, and I'll just talk. Man, my soul waits in silence, trusting in the power of God. I don't have to win every fight. In fact, I don't have to win most fights. Actually, I should say, I don't have to win any fights. I just have to believe in the one who does, and the one who always wills, and that is God. See, God has a power that triumphs all the inner evils that you could imagine. And you don't have to sort out every single thing you encounter. You can leave that in God's hands, and God's power is sufficient. But not only will it take care of the inner evils, it'll take care of the outer evils. So we'll pull up the next set of verses, right? So 4 and 5 talks about inner evil. Then we come down to 9 through 11, and he talks about these outward evils, particularly verse 10. "Put no trust in extortion." Okay, extortion's pretty visible evil. "Set no vain hopes on robbery." Okay, again, pretty outward form of evil. "If riches increase, set not your hearts on them." That's not to say riches increasing is always evil, but a lot of people use some evil ways to increase their riches. The psalmist is trying to make it clear. It doesn't even matter if the evil is on the inside or if the evil is on the outside. You see again in verse 11. "Once God has spoken, twice I've heard. That power belongs to God." Man, you want to fight evil? Don't. Let God do the fighting. Right? That's maybe not the most comforting thing, because it'd be a lot easier if you put a spiritual weapon in my hand so that I could go out and do the fighting. Then I've got control. See, now I think we come to the crux of the matter, right? In order for you to truly be faithful, you are relinquishing control and letting God be God and you be his people. And this is what I think God is saying, what the psalmist is wanting you to understand. You don't need to fight the battle. Go hang out in the amphitheater in the back of the refuge. You go take comfort in God and let God be the fortress that fends off all the evil that is out there. God's got sufficient power to do it. Again, read the Bible from cover to cover. You cannot come away thinking God is a powerless sort of God. Even if you're just choosing bits and pieces of the Bible to read, you're often coming across the extreme power that God has. This is a God whose power is capable of accomplishing all the good there is to accomplish and defeating all of the wickedness that there is. So again, you might ask, okay, well, what now? Right? If I'm supposed to put my trust only in God, and I'm supposed to let him do the fighting, and I trust in his power to defend the evils, then what should I actually do? If I'm not called to arms, if I'm not called to go around attacking all the things, then what am I supposed to be doing? Maybe that's the question that you want to know. The psalmist says, I got you covered. Let me give you the answers. Your job is to understand that God's refuge earns your trust and your steadfast love. That's what you get to do. Go trust in God. Go place your love in God. That's your calling. Not to necessarily tick off 400 boxes of spiritual practices and not to go around fighting evil with your spiritual swords. What you are called to do as part of God's people is let God be God and put your trust and your love in him. That's what we do. There is a biblical assurance that God does not fail anytime. All right, now we can pull up verse 8 here. Trust in him at all times. Again, not some of the time, not part-time, at all of the time. You can trust in God to be the refuge for your heart, for your soul. O people, pour out your heart before him. So when I say trust, right, trust in the Lord, that's a hard thing. It's a deep thing. What it means is, you can literally share. Some of you have been in relationships where there is genuine trust, right? And you can talk to them. It's 3 a.m, something's on your heart and mind, and you can pour out your soul to this individual. It might be a 6-hour phone call, and you are just pouring out your soul to this person. Maybe you feel like it's nonstop blabbering, but the other person is there taking it all in and accepting you. And see, that's what we get to do with God. Again, the beautiful avenue of prayer that Christians have is you can blabber as much as you want in prayer with no structure, and you're going all over the place, and you feel like it's convoluted, and God just says, keep on giving, keep on giving, keep on giving, because I got it covered. And I got all the power I need to sort out all of your vocabulary. So I grew up, I was homeschooled, I had to diagram sentences, and you have to know exactly where the words go on which line, what's the subject, what's the verb, what's the conjunction, what's the prepositional phrase and the clause, and you're trying to figure everything out. Well, often when you pray, or at least when I pray, it's not all that structured, and if you had to diagram my prayer, it's like you're having to pull from a lot of places, and this is really cool about God. He just says, just throw it all in there, right? Just throw all your needs, all your wants, all your cares, all your worries. Just pour it out. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge. I haven't done this in a while, but there was a time in college where I would literally take hours. And I'm not trying to boast here. I'm just trying to share. Maybe it's a rebuke to myself. I haven't done this in a while. But I would take hours in blocks and just pray. And I have never since then felt quite as much peace as when I spent 3+ hours straight in prayer. Again, I'm not trying to pat myself that saying I've ever done that, but I've done it a couple times in my life, and it has always been transformative. And maybe you can say, well, I just don't have those sorts of hours, and I'm not judging, but I'm just telling you, when you pour out your heart to God, and there were some hard days. Not that I've had a hard life. I've had a very blessed life. But I've had some hard days watching people struggle and fail, and I can do nothing, and I pour out my heart to God. And I tell you, every single time when I pour out my heart to God, I feel better. Like it's this emotional, cathartic thing when you just say, God, I surrender control because I can't get this done. I'm not sufficient. I'm not powerful enough. But we know who is, because God is a refuge for us. And so you pour out your heart, and God listens. If you've ever had a relationship on earth that is even close to that, where you can just share anything, that is one of the most special relationships you can ever find, whether it's your spouse, whether it's your best friend, whether it's your child or a sibling. When you've got someone that you can just share anything and everything with, that's special. And that earns a special sort of trust, and that trust turns into love. And so this brings up, if we can pull up our final verse here, verse 12. This is what happens then when you've got all of that trust going on, right? Verse 8, trust in the Lord at all times. When we get to verse 12, that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love. When you trust in God at this level, there's not really any other option but to love God as well. I find it very difficult to say that I could trust in the Lord but not love the Lord. Because once you've put that level of trust in the Lord, and especially when you have watched the Lord fulfill promise after promise after promise, and the Lord comfort you time and time again, and the Lord bless and bless and bless, when you watch that happen so many times, there is no other outcome but steadfast love. Not just a temporary love, but a steadfast love. Not just sometimes trust, but in all times trust. God is a refuge for his people. And the cool thing about God as refuge is that Satan, in all of the years of creation, has still never figured out how to beat the fortress. It's like one of those puzzles where you keep trying to figure out, well, what if I did this and then did this? Would I get to the conclusion? And Satan has just never figured it out. And we get this biblical assurance that Satan never will figure it out. Like Satan's just always going to keep coming at the fortress. That there's truth to that, right? Satan will keep coming at the fortress until Judgment Day. But the biblical promise is that Satan's never going to beat the fortress. Doesn't matter how time moves on and technology moves on and what new things Satan tries. God's fortress will always be the fortress. It will always be a refuge for you. So church, the call is for you to trust in the Lord at all times. Pour out your heart before him. Love the Lord with a steadfast love. And no matter if you're facing inner evil or outer evils, you will find a refuge for your soul at all times. Church, if you want some prayers of encouragement, if you would like the elders, myself, to talk with you more about how God can be your refuge, if you've never placed faith in Jesus Christ and found that comfort of the Lord as refuge, we want to invite you to do that. We're going to give an opportunity for response